Hello, everyone. I am Iker Alustiza, member of the research team for this project. And as Jan just mentioned, let's talk about the life cycle of a sidechain in the Lisk ecosystem. So as you can see here in the agenda, 3 main phases for the life cycle of a sidechain. The first one will be the connection of this sidechain into the ecosystem, done by the chain registration process. The second one is the active phase, which is the main phase for this life cycle, because the main interoperability or the important interoperability will happen here. And then we have the termination of a sidechain. This one is not a mandatory step in the life cycle of a sidechain, but there are certain conditions that if they are met, a sidechain will be terminated. And we want to see, well, which are those conditions and what is this concept of termination. Before anything else, a little preamble. So if you want to connect a sidechain into the ecosystem, first the sidechain should exist, at least, right? In particular, this means 2 requirements. The genesis block of this sidechain has to be created, and the first block of this blockchain to start in the future. And also the sidechain validators, certain validators for this sidechain, they have to be ready to start like adding blocks on top of this genesis block. Those are the requirements. Interesting thing here is that our interoperability solution has the flexibility that no matter if, imagine that we have only the genesis block waiting there, standing alone, doing nothing. Or on the other hand, we have the sidechain running already for months, of course, independently by its own, like an independent blockchain. In both scenarios, the sidechain will be connected in the same way. So there is no difference there. And yeah, let's see how we connect this sidechain to the ecosystem, right? So this connection of the sidechain into the ecosystem is like a 2-step process. The first step is the sidechain registration on main chain, and it is done by the sidechain registration transaction. Nothing complex with this transaction. 3 properties we can see here. The name of the sidechain, that has to be unique in the ecosystem. The ID of this genesis block that I just talked about. We will use this information to compute the sidechain network ID, which is also, well, it's necessary to avoid replay attacks in the ecosystem. And then the sidechain validators. Those validators that are in charge of signing the first cross-chain update from the sidechain to the main chain. This cross-chain update that Jan just mentioned before, this concept. So we have to store also or set this information in the sidechain registration transaction. When this transaction is processed, we have the sidechain account created on the Lisk main chain, on the state of the Lisk main chain. This sidechain account is a complex structure, a lot of properties. I am not going to cover all of them in this talk, but the first important point for this sidechain account is that it is providing the Lisk main chain with the necessary structures and logic around those structures for the actual proper cross-chain communication to happen between the Lisk main chain and the sidechain. So that's the main idea that is like included in this sidechain account. But we can say something about the main properties. The first one is the chain ID or identifier of the chain, right? Very simple. It's just an integer. By protocol, the Lisk main chain is chain ID equals 1 as a constant. And then the new registered sidechains will be assigned the next available integer. So 2, 3, 4, as long as they are being registered into the Lisk ecosystem. There is no upper bound for this. So this means that the Lisk ecosystem, there is no limit on how many sidechains we can register in the Lisk ecosystem. I think it's an interesting fact. Then the usage of this chain ID, well, very similar to the address for a user account, right? If you want to send something to a certain sidechain, you will use this chain ID of this sidechain to identify this sidechain, the target sidechain. Okay, this is for the chain ID. The name of the sidechain, we saw that as a property in the sidechain registration transaction. Network ID, also computed from that transaction. Validators. The validators property, interesting property. This one, well, the initial value of this property is given already in the sidechain registration transaction. We saw that. But this property, the value of this property is going to be updated along the time. When new cross-chain updates come from the sidechain to the main chain, some of them are going to update this property. And basically, in this property, we contain the information of who are the sidechain validators, the active validators that are adding or creating blocks in the sidechain at the moment. So this is contained in this one. Then these two, we have the inbox and the outbox properties. As the name suggests, they are used to somehow keep track of the cross-chain messages between, well, what is leaving the sidechain account, what is reaching the sidechain account, right? Like a normal email, the same concept of inbox and outbox. Of course, it's much more complex than that, but here, tomorrow we are going to see more details about how these structures work, but here it's okay with the concept of these two properties. And the last one is the status. A sidechain account can be registered, active, or terminated. Another important point here to mention is that what I have been saying here for the sidechain registration on main chain happens almost the same for the main chain registration on the sidechain. And this will be the second step on this connection to the ecosystem phase, which is done by this main chain registration transaction on the sidechain. And this has to happen always after the sidechain registration on main chain. Why? Because you see here the properties. We are telling the sidechain which chain ID it was assigned on main chain with the previous sidechain registration transaction, which name was assigned also on the main chain, and also we have to tell the sidechain which are the main chain validators that are in charge of signing the first cross-chain update from the main chain to the sidechain in this case. So it's the other way around. Now it's from the main chain to the sidechain, these validators that we set in this property. And that's it. Very similar process now that we have the main chain account created in the sidechain state, in this case. As you can see here, chain ID equals 1, because it's the Lisk main chain, so it has chain ID equals 1, we said that, and the status registered. That's it. The connection to the ecosystem is done with this two-step process that finishes now, but still, the sidechain is not active. Like, users cannot connect or communicate with the sidechain yet in the ecosystem. So let's see what is the condition to activate the sidechain, to move to the active phase. As you can see in the title of the slide, to activate the sidechain, we need a first cross-chain update coming from the sidechain, posted on the main chain, and signed by those sidechain validators that we saw in the sidechain registration transaction. Those, they have to sign this cross-chain update. When this transaction is posted on the Lisk main chain, we say, well, basically the sidechain account is moved from registered, status registered, to status active. As simple as that. And that's it. Now the sidechain is active. It can start to interoperate. Users can start sending cross-chain messages. And here is when we say that this paradigm of cross-chain certification is happening during this active phase. This cross-chain certification is actually the title of the next talk by my colleague Andreas. So now I am not going to say anything of how or what's going on around this one. I am much more interested in seeing what is the requirement for the sidechain to stay in this active phase forever or as long as possible. In other words, we want to see what happens around the sidechain that can make that this sidechain is terminated. So this is the last phase of the life cycle. Yeah, for a sidechain to, the main requirement, let's put it that way, the main requirement for a sidechain to stay active in the Lisk ecosystem is that it has to post at least one cross-chain update every month onto the main chain. This is what we call the liveness requirement. If the sidechain fails to do so, if it takes longer than a month to post this cross-chain update, the sidechain account will be terminated on the Lisk main chain. So the liveness requirement is, we say, has been broken. What is this concept of termination of a sidechain? Well, basically, the connection is terminated. This means that the sidechain is officially outside of the Lisk ecosystem. Users cannot connect with it. Cross-chain updates, cross-chain messages sent from the sidechain will be rejected on Lisk main chain, and that's it. It is officially no longer part of the whole Lisk ecosystem. Interesting to mention that this termination of the sidechain, it can happen for other reasons, not for only like breaking this liveness requirement. Especially it can happen if the sidechain is sending wrong data. I mean, for example, a cross-chain update with the wrong format. This will also terminate the sidechain. But important to say that if the sidechain is following the interoperability protocol, as it should, like every sidechain should follow the interoperability protocol in the Lisk ecosystem, this will never happen. So it has to something on purpose on the sidechain for this to happen. Okay, now we saw the concept of sidechain termination, but if I am now looking at this from the user point of view, then imagine that I have some Lisk tokens in the sidechain that now is terminated. I had some Lisk tokens, I had some NFTs, other tokens, and now it's like, what can I do? I cannot access them anymore because the connection is terminated. I cannot interact with the sidechain. Did I lose control of all these things that I had in the sidechain? For this situation, we have the sidechain recovery transactions. These transactions are a pure on-chain process, Lisk main chain on-chain process. So everything happens on the Lisk main chain. This means that the validation and the processing of these transactions, everything is with information on the Lisk main chain. They are also trustless in the way that the user to send this transaction, they don't need to trust or any requirement from the sidechain or from third-party users, whatever. Again, everything happens on the Lisk main chain, and if you trust the Lisk main chain, you can send these transactions without problem. And the last one, these transactions are secure. This means that as long as the Lisk main chain is secure, so it's progressing as expected, as usual, these transactions can be sent, and they will be processed, and tokens will be recovered. Okay, so again, tomorrow, my colleague Maxime will have a talk only covering this topic, the topic of the recovery mechanism. So here I am just going to give you like a very general overview and the concept of these recovery transactions, right? So the concept here for this recovery mechanism will be that with information on Lisk main chain, users can prove that they own certain cross-chain messages, tokens, NFTs in that sidechain that now is terminated. They can prove that with these transactions. And also they can do that efficiently. This means that a single recovery transaction can recover many tokens, many NFTs, like in an array. So it's not only one per transaction. And also any user can send them. This means that if I am a third-party user, I can recover tokens for other users. Not that I am going to get these tokens for me now. No, I will prove that these tokens belong to the original users, the original owners, and these tokens are going to be sent automatically to the original owners. But I will be doing the work for them. So for this recovery mechanism to happen, we defined 3 different transactions. The message recovery transaction, the first one. This one allows us to recover pending cross-chain messages that are in the sidechain account. This means those cross-chain messages that are not still part of the actual sidechain, that they haven't been applied or processed in the sidechain. Those cross-chain messages can be recovered with this transaction. The second one is the token recovery transaction. In this one, token balances that are already in the sidechain, in this case they are already in the state of the sidechain, they can be also recovered back to the original sidechain or chain in general. Very interesting, this includes also the Lisk token. So if you're a user, you had certain Lisk tokens, a balance of Lisk tokens in the sidechain. The sidechain now is terminated, you have no problem. You will send this transaction, and those Lisk tokens that were in the terminated sidechain, they will be sent back to the Lisk main chain and added to the balance of your user account as a normal transfer, let's say. And then we have the NFT recovery transaction, which is basically the same idea as token recoveries, but for NFTs. So users can recover specific NFTs from the terminated sidechain back to the original chain. And that's it. That's the general idea for these recovery transactions. Let's go now over a quick summary of what we saw during this talk, during the life cycle of a sidechain. So we started talking about the connection step, the connection phase, which was done by this chain registration concept. First, sidechain was registered on mainchain. Second, mainchain was registered on sidechain. But still, the sidechain was not ready to be like or interoperate in the ecosystem. For that, we need the first cross-chain update posted on mainchain from the sidechain. When this happens, we say that the sidechain is already active. We are in the active phase for this sidechain. This means that users can start interacting with the sidechain, specifically, in special, sending cross-chain messages and so on. That you will see more in the incoming talks. Okay, we said that the sidechain, if the sidechain is doing things right, it should be in this active phase forever. But certain things can make that this sidechain is terminated. The important requirement that we saw is the liveness requirement, that we need one cross-chain update posted on the Lisk mainchain per month. Otherwise, the sidechain will be terminated. But for users, this is not a big problem, because users can always recover tokens, NFTs, whatever, with these sidechain recovery transactions that we just presented. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.